Good morning. It's been a little bit of a break since we've been in here, huh? Matter of fact, as I look around, it looks like the attendance is down a little bit, so I'm sure I'll be getting lots of emails here shortly going, I didn't know there was a lecture today, which always makes me have to say, that's a shame. It's too bad. But anyways, today we are very fortunate today to have one of our former alums, former graduates here, who's a star in industry, and it's always a pleasure to get back some of our distinguished women graduates and their accomplishments in business. So today we have Ms. Diane Aigotti. She is the Chief Financial Officer and the Managing Director of the Ryan Specialty Group. If you guys don't know what that is, it's an international specialty insurance organization that provides innovative solutions for brokers, agents, and insurance carriers. And she has been at RSG since its inception. I'm sure she's probably part of that standing up that organization, given that she had formerly been at Aon Corporation. And if you know anything about RSG, it was founded by the former chief executive and founder of Aon. So prior to joining RSG, like I said, she spent almost 8 years as a corporate officer at Aon Corporation, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly right, but where she served as the Senior Vice President, the Chief Risk Officer, and the Treasurer, with responsibilities for global treasury, risk management, acquisitions, and divestiture activities. During her 10 years, she led the multi-year divestiture program of several major operating units, including 2 insurance subsidiaries, resulting in over $4 billion in proceeds. She has served as the Vice President of Finance at the University of Chicago Hospitals from 1998 to 2000, and served as the Budget Director at the City of Chicago from 1995 through 1997, after spending several years in position at the Mayor's Office and the Budget Office. Ms. Aigotti has served on the board of directors of the Private Bancorp Incorporated and the Private Bank and Trust Company since 2015, and previously served on the board of directors of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago from 2008 through 2015. Like I said, she received her MBA from the University of Notre Dame and a Bachelor's of Arts in Economics and Government from St. Mary's College across the street. So on that note, please extend a warm welcome to Ms. Diane Aigotti.
Good morning, everybody. It's really an honor to be here, and there's so many of you. I really appreciate being invited back. It's hard when you sit and you go back and you think about your history and what perhaps you might have to say that has meaning to folks like you who are just starting out or at least very early in your career. And so I tried to take a step back and think about not just my career experience, but my life experience and perhaps where there are common threads and how that might have a lesson or two that might be worth actually sharing with you. That was a very nice introduction. I would spend just a couple of minutes giving you a little bit of my background just for the sake of maybe eating up the clock a little bit. Nothing wrong with that. As you said, I've started my career. Actually, I graduated from St. Mary's and I went to work in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years in politics. I had a case of the Potomac fever and I spent a couple of years out in Washington and quickly got very frustrated and decided I would make a transition, and I went back to business school thinking that that was a way of getting some technical skills and also just a good transition point into something completely different. I spent 2 years in business school and ended up going back and working for Mayor Daley at the City of Chicago, which was not at all what I had intended. But I got an introduction to somebody who was the CFO of the city at the time, who reminded me a lot of my father, and I just took a chance. And I ended up starting to work there, and I'll tell you more about my experience later, but it was a leap of faith that was an amazing experience. And I learned a lot, and it made me very popular at cocktail parties. And I think now, when I look back, I probably learned more than I realized at the time. As you said, I went from there to, I worked at University of Chicago. I was there very briefly and decided I really wanted to get into the private sector. So I had met a lot of people when I was at the city of Chicago, and went to interview with Pat Ryan and the man who was his CFO at the time, who I was very taken with. And so I started at Aon, not because I had some burning desire to be in the insurance industry, quite the contrary. I probably took it despite the reputation of the insurance industry and have never looked back since then. I have two children, 5th grade and 8th grade, and I'm married and we live in the city of Chicago, and my kids go to the University of Chicago lab schools. So that gives you a little perspective of who I am. I would say I promised Pat Ryan, who is my boss and my mentor and a very close friend, that I would take this opportunity while you're a captured audience to give a plug for the insurance industry. He said so many young people have such a bad view of what the industry is. You can't pass up an opportunity to give a plug to an industry that has been so good to you. And I agree with him. He's 100% right. So I would spend a few minutes talking to you about what insurance is. I think it's important to realize, certainly when you see things from a great distance and you only see perhaps, what's in the newspaper, which isn't much, that the industry is very broad and very specialized. There is a lot of insurance that's bought by you or your parents for your car and your house, right? Health insurance, that sort of thing. We're not in the retail end of the insurance business. We're not State Farm and Allstate. We don't sell to people, we sell business to business. Every company in America, no matter how small they are, has to manage their risk and has to be very cognizant of risk management, not just as it relates to things that you can insure, but as it relates to critical risks in your business. Things like key man risk if you lose a critical employee, things like economic cycles, so on and so forth. What we do is, what Aon did was represent corporate clients to buy a wide spectrum of insurance placements. Things like, yes, property, casualty insurance, like business interruption, D&O, every company, certainly publicly traded company, needs directors and officers insurance. Most companies need some sort of liability coverage. They're all trying to buy health benefits for their employees. And many companies, the world is a global place. There are people buying political risk insurance. There is all kinds of very complex, highly analytical products and analysis being supported in the marketplace. Because the world is getting smaller and risk is more understood, the amount of things that are being insured and the amount of dollars flowing through the industry is growing. And it's nice to be in a growing industry. It's nice to be in an industry that's not commoditized. And insurance is not a commoditized thing. It's a highly specialized thing. There are companies that provide the capital, that put up the balance sheet. I've never been with one of those. I've always been on the service side. And the company I'm with now, Ryan Specialty Group, is in the most highly specialized area of the industry. So we do things like well drilling and long-term care facilities and massive construction projects and highly risky directors and officers placements and earthquake and flood and hurricane placements, all for companies. We do a lot with the US, we do a lot internationally. London is still a huge market. There's a lot of the high-risk business that goes through Lloyd's of London, which is a fascinating thing and a little bit of a throwback to the early days of the financial industry where people were still on trading floors. It's got a very interesting and unique history. So the other thing I would mention to you about the industry at large and certainly our company and the service end of the business, it is at it is still at an inflection point in terms of innovation and technology. So when you think about technology and how highly integrated technology is into every discipline, I'm the CFO at the company, and I spend half my day on technology-related issues, whether it's systems, new systems designs, how technology is going to change our business processes and our cost structures, how we're going to figure out how to invest in technology. It's not cheap. How we're going to protect our intellectual capital and our IP, intellectual property. These are things that no matter where you are in any business are now core to your business. It's no longer, let's get the guy from, the IT department to come help us figure this out. It is a core function of any of your disciplines. Everybody is thinking about how technology and artificial intelligence will affect how your business is going to develop, how you're interacting with your clients, how it's going to affect your marketplace. And so it's something you have to know no matter who you are and what your role is in any company. It is an enabler. It is also something that is moving faster than you are. And so it is something I highly encourage you to get exposure to. I think the other thing about the industry is that it's at an inflection point, and it is a very talent-hungry place. And what I found that I would advise to you is the places sometimes where you can make the highest impact and you can have the biggest opportunity is not the place where everybody's rushing to go. It's the places where they're not rushing to go. Because those places are opportunities where they are hungry for talent and they're open to impact. And I think that my career and my personal experience, that is a really important message that I would leave with you, something that I feel very personally. If everybody in the class wants to be in a PE fund, look elsewhere. Because everyone's going to be tripping all over themselves to do the same thing. You want to go places where everybody else isn't rushing. That's where the greatest opportunity happens to be. And it takes the marketplace and what people understand a very long time to realize that you need to spread out and not bunch up, right? It's not, your career isn't all like 5-year-olds playing soccer where everybody chases the ball around the field, right? Spread out and look at what you're doing. Look at what's going on around you and in the world, because opportunities will present themselves in places you had never considered. I think insurance is one of those places because it's not going away. It's in great demand, and it is highly specialized and analytical. And so it's going to create a lot of opportunity. Diversity is also something that's very, very valued. Companies are looking for it, not just in terms of gender and color, but in thought. Diversity in thought, in approach, right? Just because it's the way we've done it is not the way we want to do it. We're trying to think about the future, and we're trying to see things from new perspectives. I think the one thing that people in the insurance industry understand is that the past is not a determinant for what the probabilities are of the future, and we're all trying to figure out how to use data in order to change all of our predictive modeling and how we view risks going forward. And we've got folks in our business who are technology folks who are figuring out how to use Google Earth to reestablish floodplain boundaries and how we price flood risk in certain regions of the country. So as I said, it's very innovative, but it's also very, very hungry for talent because it's just not, conventional wisdom isn't, I'm going to insurance because that's where, I'm going to make my mark, which is why the opportunities are enormous. So I would leave you with that. That is my official plug. I think the other thing I'll tell you a little bit now, I think, about our company. So as I told you, I've worked in government, I've worked in nonprofit, and I've worked in the private sector in a large publicly traded company. I've been on the board of a couple publicly traded companies. I was on Private Bank, which we just sold to CIBC, which is a huge Canadian bank. That is a lecture unto itself, I would tell you. And I'm also on the board of GATX, which is a railroad, publicly traded railroad leasing and operations company. And I was on the board of what's called a GSC. It's a government-sponsored entity that basically funds all your community banks and many of the large banks that's out there to keep them liquid. And played a very big role after the crash. So I've had a little bit of perspective across the industry or across the economy, essentially. And Ryan Specialty Group is my first experience with a startup and my first experience in a privately held company. And it's really been a fascinating time, I think, to be in a privately held company. The marketplace has changed so dramatically. When I came out of school, being in a publicly traded company was a big deal, right? Everything was, I want to get public company experience. And I'm really glad I did. I'm sure I wouldn't have been on a publicly traded boards if I didn't know how the capital markets worked, how publicly traded companies work, what the governance structure is, what the market expectations are, how you have to deal with investors on earnings calls every quarter, SOX, blah, 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 blah. I could go on forever. The structure and the requirements in a publicly traded environment are very, very good disciplines to know and very worthwhile. That structure can also be a little bit constricting. And so after 7-8 years in a publicly traded company, particularly as a corporate officer and in finance roles, I thought I want to do something completely different. And I'm going to take a risk. I could probably make a lot more money over here, but if I find the right thing, there's huge opportunity from a learning experience as well as a financial opportunity. And so I really started looking for new business opportunities or new businesses as opposed to another large company. And I found one. It happened to be the gentleman who founded Aon, which now I think is probably 50, 60,000 people globally, decided to leave Aon and start up something new. He's at heart an entrepreneur, and building to him is the most fun part. And I heard stories for years about how much fun it was making acquisitions and putting the company together and weaving together a culture and an identity and building an employee base and touching communities all over the world. And I thought, you know, I was there when it was a battleship and I had to figure out how to turn the battleship. And I'd like to be somewhere at the building phase. Not where we're looking for single-digit organic growth, but we're really looking for very high growth. And so he called me. He had one employee and a very clear idea of what he wanted to do. And I knew him, I knew his character, I knew his integrity, and I knew his past, and I didn't even know how much I was going to make, and I said, yes, I'm going to do this, because where am I going to get this call again, right? Where I don't have to due diligence the people I'm working with. I only have to sign on to the vision of the company. And so I was employee number 3. I walked in, and while I had always had a vast infrastructure, we had nothing. We didn't even have a checking account. I didn't know how to open a checking account. I had people who did that. So now I had no people. Oh my God. So the first thing I had to do was get some people. And I think one of the things that I look back on now that's really remarkable is that Pat's approach to hiring people was to look for people who wanted to make a stake in something new, but also people that he might have to pay up a little for early on, but could take the company where he wanted to go in 10 and 15 years. A lot of startups go through this process where the founders or the early participants can't necessarily operate it and take it to the point where it's really sizable. And they hire for their fit to purpose at the beginning and not necessarily for what they want to be in the future. And a lot of times that's a financial imperative. You just don't have the money and you've got to do what you got to do, right? We didn't do that. We really went out and said, we're going to take a chance that we're going to be $500 million in 5 or 6 years. And in order to sustain that pace responsibly, we've got to have people who know how to put out financial statements, who know how to put infrastructure in place. You have to have infrastructure. You got to pay people. You got to have, open enrollment for people to have, right? You got to set up 401ks and you have to run them. You have to have a financial system, which is no fun to turn on, I might tell you. You've got to be able to do these things. You've got to be able to attract and retain talent. You have to be able to report to your bank group. You're going to want to borrow money. It is economically important to be able to borrow some money. You're going to want to get investors at some point. How do you build that infrastructure fast enough to keep pace with a business that's going to grow rapidly? We make a lot of acquisitions every year, and we've probably made 20-some in 5 years. Integrating acquisitions and integrating them quickly, not just in terms of the culture of the business, but putting them on your control structures, on your systems, is enormously important. And if you do it too far down the road, you will always regret it. I am a firm believer in that. I've lived the good decisions and the bad. And you've got to attract the people who can do that, because the guys on the front line and the gals on the front line, they're not going to be doing that because they're out nurturing the business. This is a lot of hard work and it's a lot of fun. But you need to get that talent in quickly, and that's not easy. And it is, however, enormously fun. I always told people in the early years, the good news is when you're at a large company or institution, you spend half your time complaining about the legacy you inherited from somebody else who made imperfect decisions. The good news is you don't have to worry about that. The bad news is you have no legacy. Whatever the bad decisions you make now are the ones that other people are going to be complaining about. And there is no perfect solution. So, we're just going to have to roll up our sleeves and get it done. So we went from 0 to 1,500 employees in 6 years. And we have 60 offices and we're in 4 or 5 different countries. And I look back on what some of the folks used to tell me at Aon about how much fun it was to put it together, and they were right. Putting it together is a lot more fun than running it once it's built. And so I've loved it. And I would encourage you to do that. And I think in this day and age, that is becoming a lot more valued than you would normally have seen when I was graduating. Everybody was, opening up the Wall Street Journal and the Cranes list of the top, 100 and, looking for interviews. There's a lot more opportunity, and it's a lot easier to get that opportunity now, particularly with the internet and emails and LinkedIn and all the rest of it. So I think as I think about sort of bringing everything together, I've been in what we would call the risk business now for 17 years. I can't believe that. It's gone so fast. I look back and I think, and I tell people, and I tell my kids this, the concept of risk and return, the relationship of risk and return that you learn in a finance class, right? That's sort of fundamental in investment theory and so forth, is true in life, right? The stuff that is risky often has the greatest benefit to your life, to your character, to your career, to your family. And I think I've learned as much about risk and risk-taking in my life as I have sort of just being in the insurance industry. And I think about that relationship a lot. In fact, my poor kids probably hear me say this all the time. Yeah, it's scary to sign up and run for student council and to lose, but you'll never win if you don't try. And you have to put yourself out there. It's what happens. And otherwise you don't get anywhere. And I try and instill that in my kids too. It's okay to take risks and it's good to fail because you learn a lot and you learn more by failing sometimes than you do succeeding. I'm a believer in looking at yourself and how you think about taking risks in your own life and thinking about it in a sort of larger sense, right? Every aspect of your life doesn't have to be risky all at the same time. I'm not suggesting that, and I would never, I would never suggest that. When I was at the city of Chicago, it was an enormously risky environment, and I was never going to make a lot of money there. They don't pay much at all, which is, I think, one of the reasons why government has a lot of problem, frankly. I mean, you make a fraction of what you would make somewhere else doing the same type of job. But the benefits that I got from doing that, both emotionally knowing what I was doing for my community and feeling like I was giving back, but also the benefit I got, I think, from a career perspective. It was a place where they're so hungry for talent and skills, they will give you an enormous amount of responsibility, probably before you're really ready for it. And I spent 6-7 years flying by the seat of my pants and making it up as I went along. I learned to play what I call the what's the worst that can happen game in my own head, right? The worst that could happen back then was really bad. People went to jail. That's bad. I don't want to go to jail. I have no intention of going to jail. In addition to that, if you made a mistake and it was a visible mistake, you were splashed all over the front pages of the newspaper. I had plenty of dear friends who got creamed fairly and unfairly for mistakes that they made. It was brutal. And so the risk was enormous. There is nothing short of stealing that you're going to do in your career that's going to get you to the point of being on the front page of the newspaper. So the worst that can happen isn't that bad. It's not as bad as you would think. And there's always another job and there's always another place. And so I would encourage you to take those risks, to be brave and, to perhaps step out of line more frequently. I wish that I had always been more brave. There are things that I look back on and I never regret putting myself out there. I only regret not doing it in certain cases. And a lot of times it wasn't even a conscious decision. It was just, for some reason, how I was wired. I'm not good at not speaking up. And so I would speak up, and sometimes it got me in trouble. Plenty of times it got me in trouble. But people learn that you have something to say, and I think it's a risk worth taking. Now, obviously, there's a balance to that. You can't be, and you don't want to be the person in the organization that nobody wants to deal with. Listening is incredibly important, but you really should think about the path that is unlikely or less or least taken. Working in government was an intense experience. And even now, sometimes I get that nightmare that wakes me up thinking, oh my God, that could have gone really bad. But it gave me a level of exposure and experience that I was never going to get at 28, 29, and 30 years old. I became budget director for the city when I was 30 years old, far too young to have that job, I might tell you. But I passed 3 balanced budgets and I got out without being shamed. I consider that to be a huge accomplishment. And it gave me a level of exposure to the civic community in Chicago, where I met many people who have names on buildings here, and certainly the chairman and CEO of Aon, and of now Ryan Specialty Group, and many other very significant people, because communities tend to have civic structures, and Chicago certainly does. And getting to know that person by name opens way more doors than having a linear career path in their organization. And so it was a risk worth taking. And I am very glad I did it. There was probably, I'm sure I was the only one in my class who went into government after I got an MBA. And it certainly wasn't what I had thought I would do, but it was really worth it. And I'm sure I wouldn't be here today because I made nonlinear jumps into positions that I would have worked another 10 years before I had a shot at if I was working my way up the normal path. So I would really encourage you to think about the nonlinear career path. I have an expertise now in certain areas that I can think about going into organizations or into companies or even into private equity situations because I have a particular expertise. I wasn't somebody who was there working 70 hours running their financial models. And I would take that path again every day of the week. It was really, really, I think, worth it, and something I would really encourage you to think about. I think the other sort of thoughts that I would leave you with, and I do want this to be interactive, so I don't want to take up all the time, is one of the things that I try to bring to my children and to the young people who work for me is I really hope that you will spend enormous amounts of time and thought and energy and spirit in places and with people who are not like you, who don't look like you, who don't come from the same place you come from, who didn't come through a middle class, upper middle class, white America experience. I hope you will spend tons of time traveling. It's the only way you really get to know other people and other cultures is to go there. I hope you will spend an enormous amount of time surrounding yourself and seeking people out who are nothing like you and learning from their perspective. There is nothing that is more stunting than being surrounded by people who come from the exact same background and history in your growth as a person and as a human being. And there are studies all over the place that diversity in the workplace produces better outcomes all the time. We talk about it, people acknowledge it, but we've still flatlined in getting there. And there's got to be a better way of doing that and pushing those boundaries. And I am a different person now than I was when I was 25 and 30 because I became exposed to people who did not have anything close to my background, my history, right? I was born in the United States. I went to very expensive schools. My parents were always very supportive. You know, I never worried about having shoes on my feet. I never worried about what I would eat. I never ducked bullets coming out of my house trying to get to school. I never worried about religious discrimination. I never worried about anything. I grew up thinking there were two kinds of people, publics and Catholics, right? Everybody who wasn't Catholic went to the public school. They were all publics. That's not the world, and that's not the world I want my kids or anybody else to be exposed to. And you will be a better person, you'll be a better executive, you'll be a better parent, you'll be a better addition to whatever organization that you sign on to if you can figure out how to get into other people's experience and other people's thoughts. The reality is a lot of buying decisions, a lot of business decisions, a lot of what goes on in the world is not driven by people that are like me or people like you. And to really understand that, you've got to spend some time with them. and you've got to be open to their experiences and their perspectives. If you're gonna be hungry for the news, read the news. Don't listen to a bunch of talking heads who are only gonna tell you and confirm your opinions that you already hold. That's not news, that's preaching to the choir. Go find sources that you think are actually unbalanced. Listen to NPR, for God's sakes. Find something that gives you real news and put yourself into other people's positions and other people's experiences. I guarantee you, you'll be a better executive and you'll be more successful in your career. It is now the market imperative. It's the world we live in. We're not going back to the 50s. Business is going to continue to be global, and that's just the way it is. So you need to be global too. And I think that's where I would leave you. Take risks and have fun. Because you have a long road. I'm happy to take any question about anything.
Obviously, can you all hear me up there? Talk both ways. Obviously, you had a diverse background, in the early stages of your career. But jumping over to the RSG, that was a big jump at least today. Of all your experiences, maybe your personal traits, what do you think best qualified you? What made you be successful in that endeavor? You had to think back and say, if somebody's out there thinking of a startup, doing like that, what did you bring that made a difference?
It's a good question. I think, obviously, I have to acknowledge that I had a good running start because I already had a relationship with the CEO of the business, right? Building that relationship, particularly as a CFO, is enormously important. That person has to trust you and you have to trust them. And trust doesn't come from a resume, it's something that you have to build. And so I had a huge leg up because of that. I mean, that to me was a unicorn opportunity, right? That was very lucky. I think that the other things that made me successful is that I had gotten to the point where I knew that I wasn't going to be able to carry the weight myself, and the first thing I did was look for help. And I looked for people who had skills that would challenge mine, and not just people who had the same skills. I wasn't looking to replicate myself. And so I really had enough experience running the financial operations and seeing how a company's structure needs to work to know where we needed to pluck skill sets from quickly. I also think one of the things that I'm very proud that we did early on is data is very complicated, particularly financial data, to produce not financial data that is GAAP-driven, that you issue to the marketplace, right? Most of your systems and your financial data that a company produces is GAAP-structured data. The reality is GAAP is a language, it's a requirement. It's not always how you judge your business. And so I spent as much time focusing on the management reporting that we needed to produce to really understand what was going on in our business as I did developing the tools to be able to report GAAP financial statements. And GAAP is actually easier than management reporting, at least in our business. And so knowing that if you want to instill the right financial disciplines to understand what the company, how the company's performing, what you need to do for the future, you've got to be able to get at those metrics that are going to help you make decisions every day. And I knew enough about the industry to have a strong feeling about what that information needed to look like. And I think it's really impacted what we did. So I would say to you, number one, it started with talent, and I suppose being wise enough at that point to know that it wasn't going to be me who was the key to the future, that I had to put a team together. And, you know, recruiting and talking people into taking the leap of faith. If you're in a new business, you're losing money, right? You're losing money for a couple of years. And that's hard, right? When you're used to reporting earnings on a quarterly basis. It's not fun reporting losses, but you have to look at it as an investment. And you have to have a vision to how you're going to get to profitability. And making sure that I built the financial disciplines and the communication to the business leaders and had a seat at the table so that I could make sure that we were on the path and we knew what we were talking about when we said we were on the path, I think was really, really important. Sure.
How big is your company today?
We are around $500,000 in revenue. I'll say around because we're private, so I'm not going to tell you how much. And we've got 15 on our way to 1,600 people. So I've just spent the last year putting in new financial and HR systems, which is a thankless task. But something, if any of you go into a company, you're going to experience a new business system implementation or new financial system implementations. And it's a thankless task, but it's a very important thing. So, and we have, you know, we constantly have new divisions. We've made 3 acquisitions so far this year. So we do a lot of M&A, and we've built a lot of internal disciplines around M&A.
Are you growing geographically or more by product?
We are. We're growing both. So we're growing in product line. We buy and we grow specialties and geography, and we are growing internationally. We just opened practices in Sweden and Denmark through a partnership with a big European carrier this year. We have offices in London. We just hung out a shingle in Mexico. We're in Canada. And we have, I don't know, 50 plus, 55 offices all over the U.S. So yeah, we just opened in Louisville, Kentucky, of all places. So, and to be honest with you, the location is about talent. We go where the talent is. Because the industry it doesn't have geographic boundaries. We don't have people in locations and give them, 5 states. That's not how things are done in our industry. We have a massive directors and officers practice that's in Hartford, of all places, and they cover the whole country. So we really go where the talent is.
Thanks.
You talked about your vision in the beginning, and you talked about it as it stands now. How has that evolved from that time? How formalized?
Formalized. I think there's a formalized aspect to it. So there are pieces that are formalized, but you have to react to the opportunities. And certainly when you're talking about being in the acquisition business, it's as much about what you want to buy as what's available to buy. So you have to be ready to move on a moment's notice when something becomes available. So we're always out shopping. We're thinking about geographies or practice groups or specialties that we want to develop in. And we may hunt for 6 months, we may hunt for 5 years. We just closed a deal at the end of last year, and we've been courting this guy for 5 years. I mean, it had the longest gestation period of any deal I've ever seen in my life. So We're at enough critical mass now where we're probably a little bit more formalized about what we want to do. And we certainly think about it from an investment capital perspective, right? We think about how much capital we want to invest and how we want to prioritize that. But what's for sale is what's for sale. A lot of businesses we're buying from entrepreneurs. And when they're ready to sell, they're ready to sell. And that may be because they have succession planning issues. It may be because they realize they need a larger platform, and they've hit some sort of wall and they just can't grow unless they have a larger platform around them. It may be because, you know, they have a tax imperative and, you know, one of the partners wants to liquidate. I mean, there's a whole host of reasons, and those things come as they come. So we are sort of known in our industry as being an inquisitive player. And so we spend a lot of time courting and talking and laying the groundwork. So, you know, but when things come up, they come up. So I think one of the things that is my job that I think about a lot, which is something I think that isn't really written about enough now, is how dramatically different the capital markets are. So, you know, when I was coming out many years ago, as I said, being in a public company and going public was a big deal, right? Everybody wanted to go public. It was all that. It was a badge of honor, right? I think that's changed in ways that I don't even know that our policymakers understand. The size of private companies now and the way they can recapitalize and raise capital is so dramatically different than the way it was 20 years ago. I think the largest private check that's been written is, I don't know, $9–10 billion, and, which is much higher than the market cap of a lot of publicly traded companies. You don't need to go public anymore. And that's a good thing, and then I think there's a public policy reason why that's a bad thing. It's a good thing because it creates a lot more opportunity for entrepreneurs and for small businesses, right? It's a really good thing to be able to raise capital and not have to go through all of the torture that it takes to be a publicly traded company, not to live one earnings release to the next earnings release, which I don't care what anyone tells you, it matters and it affects you, right? You're always thinking about that next earnings call. It's such a treadmill, I guess is the way I would say it. But the capital markets now are so flush, and there's so much money out there. We spend more time turning away money than taking it. And we have a capital strategy of how we're going to buy in the next generation, get them embedded in the business, liquidate existing shareholders, grow and raise more capital. Getting capital is not a problem. It just isn't a problem. Getting good capital can be a problem. Nothing's worse than a bad husband or a bad partner. Not that I've ever had a bad husband, but I've read books. Nothing's worse than being in business with somebody you don't like. And so we've been very, very selective about whose money we've taken. Now, you know, the gentleman who started our company is an icon in the industry, right? So he doesn't have to go on Shark Tank to try and convince somebody to give him $500,000. We turn people away, but we're very, very thoughtful about that, and it's important to the young people in the company. They want to know what's going to happen, and they also don't want to be on the flipping train, where you have one owner, they need to liquidate their fund, you get flipped, right? Now you have a new owner, they need to meet their hurdles, they put in all these preferred tranches on their securities in front of you, and they need to flip you because they have to shut out their fund and you're in somebody else's fund. That's not where we wanted to live, and you don't need to live there anymore. The markets are so flush, and there's so many ways of raising money now that it just doesn't have to happen. I think the bad side of that is more and more wealth is accumulating in private hands, and I think it's adding to the income and wealth disparities in the country, and I really believe that. And I don't, right, it's just happening, but I think it's going to happen more and more. if private companies are taxed less, right? Almost all private companies structure as pass-through LLCs or S-corps. They don't do that because, you know, they love it and they get a badge. They do it because it's easier and you pay less taxes, right? I mean, that's why you do it. And it is very difficult to be public in that kind of a structure. A few private equity guys have done it, but they all trade at discounts. So it's not a great way of being public. And so more and more wealth is moving out of the public domain. And I think there will be policy implications, public policy implications for that. I don't know what it'll be, but time will tell. That's my personal feeling. I'm sure there's a lot of people who would disagree with me. In fact, I know there's a lot of people who would disagree with me.
So my question comes from the kind of context of being in Chicago. Kind of what would be kind of your background with the government and moving to private enterprise, kind of a recommendation to draw and incentivize these private enterprises to kind of provide their value back to the, you know, these government municipalities, for whether it's a social infrastructure, sustainability change, because like one of the things you talk about the tax part, and I know that the government, obviously in Chicago, trying to figure out like what the sugar tax is like, and so now we're taxing orange juice.
Right.
And because of that, I've got some friends in the grocery industry that they're actually moving and seeing decline in sales because they're going to the other counties. So how do you kind of, or what's kind of your recommendation to make private enterprises want to be more engaged with the government while also understanding how to navigate that bureaucracy that exists?
Yeah. Well, there's no good answer. There's a lot of answers in my view. I really think that the tone at the top makes a huge difference. For better or for worse, Daley, when I worked at the city, in my opinion, had a very close relationship with some of the business leaders. And Chicago had been through a lot then. So it may have been as much about their wanting to be very involved. A lot of the businesses in Chicago, they have a true love for the city. It's in their blood, right? It's personal. I always laugh that, you know, if people ask me what state I'm from, I always say Chicago, right? I think people feel very intensely about Chicago, and I'm not from Chicago, so it's not something I felt necessarily when I went there. So many of my friends in college went to Chicago. I went to Washington, D.C. because I didn't want to go where everybody else was going, even though I ended up there. It's very difficult, right? I think that the governments are in a rock and a hard place because they have to find sources of new revenue. They don't want to raise property taxes because it's very regressive. And, you know, the county raised the sugar tax, right? Mayor Bloomberg in Chicago is funding all these ads in support of the sugar tax, right? He thinks it should be like national. That would eliminate the boundary issue, right? You wouldn't be able to drive to, you know, wherever and buy your, you know, your orange juice or your sugar pop or whatever. It's a very difficult thing to do, and they really have to raise or balance, you know, cutting services and raising revenue. And so they're always looking for the most palatable bad option. And I think that you're never going to make everybody happy. The county's in a horrible position because you think about what the county funds. Cook County Hospital, right? And the sheriff's office and the prison system. I mean, that's what they fund. And the costs aren't going down. They're only going up. And so they're in they're in a really bad position, and they have limited access to ways of raising money. I mean, I think the better way of looking at some of these issues is, you know, on a state level and on a national level. But we don't do that, and we pit community against community and state against state. When I worked for the city, we had probably 10, 15 gas stations, right? And everybody drove to right by the casino, right, down on the Indiana border to buy their gas. I mean, there's some gas stations right downtown because it was too far to go to the suburbs or to Indiana. And then there was nothing that rang, right, because you'll drive another 5 blocks to avoid the gas tax. I mean, it's a constant problem. I think, you know, you really have to look at it as the lesser of the two evils, right? I have a series of choices of what I can do to raise the money. I'm not here to tell you that there's not a lot that government couldn't do to cut costs, but they're not going to cut their way out of these kinds of deficits, right? I mean, it's just not going to happen. The map isn't there. People can yammer on about fraud, waste, and abuse. There's not enough fraud, waste, and abuse to solve, you know, a national or state debt, you know, crisis. I do think, however, that the government would be much better served if they had better financial stewardship. Again, that's not going to solve all the problems, but we wouldn't be in a pension situation if we hadn't made bad decisions. Illinois and Chicago have massive pension deficits. When I was budget director of the city, every city pension fund, except for the firefighters, because they give away benefits like candy, was overfunded. It wasn't that long ago, they were all overfunded. We were talking about whether we should restructure the plans because they were all overfunded. So we dug a hole very, very, very rapidly, and that's a lack of financial stewardship. That's all it is. So it's not a great answer to your question, but you know, they're not going to let people out of the prisons, and people aren't going away from Cook County Hospital. So there's only a few things, a few levers you can pull, and the levers aren't good. So it's not my favorite way of raising revenue, but it's probably better than property taxes. Want to talk about Harry Weinstein? That was a big story today. Well, thank you.
But on that note, though, especially since we're NDA went through that, how have you seen things evolve since you graduated into the marketplace with respect to gender equality in corporate America, especially at the top? How do you see things going? Are they improving? Where do we need to go further? Excuse me, have some women here as well on that issue.
You know,
I'll just say right now, just inside the college business, on the undergraduate side, we see it going the other way again. We're seeing less and less women applying to come into undergraduate business. I'm not sure where they're on the graduate side, but we're competing for the talent, and they're not necessarily coming in droves into the business side.
right.
It's a bit of a concern.
You know, I think that there is undoubtedly a greater awareness and desire to do better. I think almost everybody in corporate America wants it to be different, and they don't know why they're not doing better in a lot of instances. And I don't know that I have the answers, but, you know, I always like to believe that, or I told myself, and I'm in, there's a group in Chicago called the Women's Network. And it's a network, it's an closed organization for, they say it's the, top women executives in institutions in Chicago, right? And so it's a lot of people who are, maybe 10 years younger than me, and then all the way up to, have been retired. And, the older women talk about how they had to walk through the back door to get into the Chicago club because they weren't allowed to go into the front door. And, they tell me stories about that, and you think, oh, it's hard for me to even imagine, right? And then you think that it has become so much less overt. Not just diversity at all level, right? Any difference, not just gender difference. And then you run into the situations and you look at the statistics and it's just not good enough. So obviously, I think most companies, particularly public companies, they know that they're going to be judged, right? Lots of people put out report cards every year about how good you're doing. And they have programs in place and they have diversity programs. And so there's this interest in doing better, but it's not paying off. We've sort of flatlined in terms of the number of women, and not even to mention the number of minorities. I think those numbers are even worse, who are on boards or who are in C-suites in companies. And so whatever we're doing is not good enough because we're leaving a massive portion of the talent pool out. And I take it to the people who work for me and to places in the organization, in our organization, and I say, how many do you have? Why don't you have more? And you're not hiring somebody unless you have diverse candidates on your interview list. And don't tell me that they're not on whatever your job website is you're using. Go find them. Call this school, call that school. Don't come back until you have somebody. And but I'm not going to tell you it's still not good enough. There was an article I read the other day about there's a large number of women who are now starting their own companies because they've just said, I've had it. I think it's cultural in an organization in my personal experience, and it's very much a tone from the top. So, I've had good and I've had bad and experiences, and I think that if it's important to the people at the top, they're going to push it into the organization and they're going to make progress. If they're not making progress, it's not important enough. That's my, personal feeling. As in terms of advice, the only advice that I could really give you is when you go somewhere, if it's not a culture you feel like you can succeed in, then don't invest your time there. Go somewhere else, right? Because they're investing in you as much as you're investing in them. No company wants to hire you and see you leave 18 months later because they have to start from scratch. And it's costly to hire and recruit people. And if you don't feel like the opportunities are going to be there in that culture, then that is not the place. And, go somewhere else. But don't wait to be invited for a seat at the table. Make sure you sit down and make sure, you make your presence known. Don't wait to be asked because other people aren't going to be waiting to be asked. So I think there's a little bit of both. The book Lean In, which I'm sure a lot of you have probably read, I'm not a big fan of those kind of things. I don't read those often. But one message did sort of resonate with me. And I think I almost sabotaged myself at one point. When my son was born, I was treasurer at Aon. And I had my son, I was older. And I felt like I had to maybe think about slowing down. I put that pressure on myself. And the gentleman who was my boss at the time said, I'm going to work this out. Don't do that. Don't do that. And I'm like, all right, but I don't know how I'm going to do it. A year later, I was fine. And I'm so grateful that he pushed me not to do it. I almost felt a pressure like I needed to. I thought I needed to, and I'm really glad I didn't. Because if I had, when I went to start up again, I wouldn't have been where I left off. And so I think that was the message in the Lean In book. It's like when you feel like you need to, lean in. The truth is, the further you get in your career, the easier it is to manage because you have a lot more supports and the company needs you more and they'll make allowances. And, I work for someone who has a family, has grandchildren, and, he's going to their kindergarten graduation and he's, going to these things and he would expect me to as well. So I've made my own path. But I feel a responsibility to open paths for others as well. And so I have to push people in the organization and say, you know, I'm looking at your numbers and they're not good enough, what are you doing? Because the people are out there. You know, you're not finding them, that's on you. Talent, every industry, and certainly our industry, it's what we talk about the most, is about talent. And you can't leave huge portions of the talent pool to the sidelines. It's massive missed opportunity. So we really need to do better. I mean, it's still real, but you know, my feeling is don't put up with it. Call people out on it. You know, but obviously it still goes on a lot more than you would think. And there's just no excuse for it. I don't care if you were raised in the 60s and 70s. That's baloney.
Anybody else?
Thank you all for your time.